A forced withdrawal left to the last possible moment. But having said that, all day there was vigorous evidence that the plan had worked. They may not have looked like an army in defeat. Perhaps they believed their president's boast from Belgrade that this was in fact a victory. But however defiant the Serb forces may have looked, they were, it seems, going quietly. And NATO has been poised to fill the vacuum that will now be left by the sudden removal of Serb domination. Which leaves the KLA.
They're being resupplied today with NATO's blessing. A convoy of 26 vehicles brought food, fuel, and water from Bosnia. There had been concern that Serb troops helping the Russians with security would stay beyond the deadline, but they appear to have gone, part of the near-panic flight of Serb civilians desperate to leave that jammed the roads out of Kosovo today. Serb military and police must be out of southern Kosovo by midnight. A NATO spokesman said they appeared to be meeting the deadline, taking everything from their best armor to scrap metal. And along their route and in their wake, burning houses. Whether the fires were set by Serbs venting their rage or Albanians getting revenge, the end result is that the ideal of security for all is turning to ashes. And NATO peacekeepers seem powerless to police the situation. Soldiers discovered ethnic Albanians looting a warehouse containing items which appear to have been stolen from Albanian homes. It only stopped when a landmine booby trap was found. In another incident, NATO troops came upon 3 Serbs who claimed to have been held prisoner and tortured by the Kosovo Liberation Army. But NATO could prove nothing. Playing policeman is not the kind of job NATO forces are best equipped to do. As one American officer put it, the best we can hope for is to be like playground monitors, keep the two sides apart while the diplomats sort out the details. But now NATO has the job. The Serbs are almost gone. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Kosovo, Polja.
Secretary.
The road out of Kosovo is where the GI's job gets tricky, overseeing the pullout of Serb armor.
Do you need to open the trunk up? Just step over here for a second.
The men in cars claim they're not soldiers, just Serbs who live here headed home. But the American troops have orders not to let them pass until they've given up their guns. Despite the language barrier, the message does get through. The war may be over, but the peace has clearly not begun. U.S. troops have been told be cautious and don't do anything provocative as long as the pullout is making progress. In the Serb...
Columns of Yugoslav tanks and troops weave their way out of Kosovo province Wednesday, roaring past NATO armor and spewing smoke at international peacekeepers in a final show of defiance. British military sources said the Yugoslav side was being very compliant, adding, "We're aware of their disposition."
And by midnight tonight, according to that agreement, all Yugoslav forces will have left Zone 1, and that includes Pristina, where we are at the moment. And at the moment, we have absolutely nothing to indicate that that will not happen substantively.
From Bosnia rumbled toward Kosovo, carrying food, water, and fuel for the 200 Russian troops who raced into Kosovo last week, beating NATO to the Pristina airport. Those forces now apparently are running out of supplies. British peacekeepers provided emergency water. A senior Russian official tells CNN there's growing concern in Moscow for the troops' safety. He says Kosovo Liberation Army forces are concentrating near the airport and unknown assailants.
Heading north to Serbia. Further south, their journey has been hampered by heavy traffic on narrow roads, and NATO has extended the deadline for their complete departure from southern Kosovo until midnight tonight.
There's up to 28,000 FOI forces who have departed Kosovo altogether, and now the southern portion is virtually clear. We're moving to Zone 2, which is central Kosovo, and Zone 3. So by Sunday midnight, all FOI forces are expected to be out of country.
But some 33,000 Serb civilians have also left Kosovo for fear of Albanian reprisals. Some set fire to their homes before they left, knowing that they would never return. Greek troops have now joined the NATO force in Kosovo. That country's historical sympathy with the Serbs made it the least enthusiastic member of NATO during the bombing campaign, and American Marines were not allowed to land in Greece until that bombing stopped. The Russians have sent a convoy of supply vehicles from Bosnia carrying food, water, fuel and money for the Russian force of 200 which took over Pristina airport and refused to let NATO troops in. As a goodwill gesture, NATO provided an escort for the convoy. And in Helsinki...
This is a Russian supply convoy coming in from Bosnia via Serbia. It was escorted most of the way by NATO vehicles. When they arrived at the airport, the Russian soldiers are seen by our crew mingling with what appear to be Serb armored troops there. What the relationship will be between the Russians and the ethnic Albanians remains to be seen. As Leon mentioned earlier, there have been some
Ross, we're just looking at the German tank, the German crew, in as relaxed a mood as one can be in this sort of situation. But what do people say to you when you just talk to them in an everyday way about how they see the future being? Can they ever see Serbs and Albanian refugees ever living together?
No, not at all. That's the simple answer. The things that the Albanian population have been through are so extreme, their exodus so brutal, their treatment over the 3 months of the bombardment in particular so terrifying, but also during the last...
Russian tanks were in the streets of Pristina last Friday night. Hundreds of ethnic Serbs gathered in the streets to celebrate the arrival of who they consider their saviors. Russian troops rolled into Kosovo before NATO did. The Russians moved out of their bases in Bosnia under radio silence and took up positions in Kosovo before the first NATO troops arrived there, a move that surprised and confounded the Western alliance. NATO tried to play down the incident. Moscow had promised that its troops would stop at the Kosovo border, but experts say Russia was worried about being left out as NATO occupied Kosovo. So the Russians took the initiative and moved in on their own. Again, NATO is trying to avoid confrontation, despite the risk of partitioning the province. The airport in Pristina, where NATO had hoped to set up its headquarters, is still under Russian control. The Russians blocked the access roads to the airport so that when the first British KFOR troops arrived in town last Sunday, the Russians wouldn't let them get anywhere near it. Later on Sunday, the Russians also blocked French troops from coming in. NATO had ordered the French to set up a fuel depot at the airport. This French officer asked the Russians whether they were going to cooperate. They said, no, not now. So the French turned around. The Russians intend to stay at the airport, confident it will guarantee them a say in peacekeeping operations. And the idea seems to have worked. The U.S. now plans to give the Russians some form of military presence in Kosovo.
This is not the kind of Russian participation the West had in mind. The Russians stole a march on NATO when they moved troops into Kosovo from Bosnia ahead of Western peacekeepers. The Russian troops have occupied the airport at Pristina, where the British had planned to set up their headquarters. And the Russians are refusing to move.
First Russian airborne in Ulyanovsk, 700 kilometers east of Moscow, and it's not necessarily the prospect of having their own sector or independent command in Kosovo. It's the $1,200 monthly pay, 20 times what they'd be earning at home, that keeps their spirits up. Russia's Kosovo presence is supposed to consist exclusively of volunteers, and there's no shortage of them for this lucrative mission. Since Russia's surprise march into Pristina, the Russian Defense Ministry in Moscow can likewise boast a new optimism. The crisis in Kosovo gives military leaders in Moscow a chance to win back some of the prestige of bygone days. General Leonid Ivashov has even gone so far as to publicly criticize Kosovo envoy Viktor Chernomyrdin. Viktor Baranets worked for 13 years in the Army General Staff and is a noted author on the Russian military.
On the one hand, Russia's push for its own military zone can be explained psychologically. For 6 years, the Russian military establishment has experienced little else except being pushed around by NATO. From the alliance's eastward expansion to the disregard of Russia on other issues, we feel, quite honestly, humiliated. On the other hand, purely military considerations also play a part. Russia has not only lost the former Warsaw Pact states as allies, What's even more painful is the steady breakup of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Nothing has come of any military planning since the fall of the Soviet Union. All that's left is Belarus and maybe Tajikistan.
Russia wants to send 10,000 men into Kosovo. Their presence there is intended to be a thorn in NATO's side rather than a true partnership. Many Russians believe the only way to regain their country's reputation abroad is through a show of strength. Russia's Kosovo mission could be a big step in that direction.
One of the Serb withdrawal now complete, NATO forces today thrust north towards the Serb border. The Serbs have until Sunday night to get out of here, but NATO is anxious to secure the routes north through Kosovo up to the Serb border. It's the first time NATO forces have been this far north, and for the Albanians, it's the end of a long ordeal at the hands of the Serbs. Not only are their forces leaving, but so are unknown thousands of Serb civilians, some having to run the gauntlet of the ethnic...
Mindless, sort of wanton nature of it. It's indiscriminate. You see a pleasant house that you sort of turn around and say, what a wonderful location or whatever, and it's destroyed. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. It's just all sort of rather senseless and mindless.
This is one of the reasons the NATO forces have driven so far forward, so fast, and so close to the Serb border, to secure the water supply for Pristina, where the situation is becoming serious. This was, still is in fact until midnight Sunday, the front line between the Serb and Albanian irregular forces. It's been secured today by NATO, but again the Serbs have left their nasty mark. The two boats, for example, are booby-trapped. Not all the damage, though, is down to the Serbs. NATO bombs destroyed much of the infrastructure in this area. For the most part today, Serb forces were persuasively adamant about not being seen on camera, but they couldn't resist showing off this unexploded NATO missile with its less than amusing messages. Tonight, NATO's front line is, ironically really, on the road north, codenamed Route Snake, at the bridge at Lausanne, where in late April a NATO bomb hit a bus, killing, according to the Serbs, 69 people. Behind them, the Serbs are gathering their forces for a final departure through NATO's new front line.
Russia's very own weaponry as proof that they're determined to disarm the civilian population that remains and the Kosovo Liberation Army.
This has all been taken from civilians who are carrying arms and members of the KLA who've entered the town carrying arms.
The Serb spilled onto the main road, gleefully indicating some very frightened Serb special police who had no getaway transport yet. The French and the British tried to calm things down, but by then the crowd had spotted the decamping Serb civilians. They jeered, kicked and spat at them. A short distance away, a huge gathering of Serb tanks, not yet having to face the sour farewell. They were glad they were going home, though. They told us sadly that they'd lost 5 of their mates when NATO bombed their headquarters. These soldiers, whose families have lived here for generations, are deciding to pull up their roots, and their departure is painful and unpleasant. For there are houses being torched as a final gesture.
But that no one threatens the peace in Kosovo, and that includes the KLA. When American NATO troops saw these guns this afternoon, they were determined to remove them. The guerrillas were reluctant. An Apache helicopter hovered overhead to help persuade them to change their minds.
We're responsible for these weapons, and we have to turn these in at our headquarters. They're registered weapons.
But the American troops got their way. On this quiet country road, in front of our camera, they disarmed the KLA fighters. NATO admits it has done little of this since entering Kosovo. NATO troops here have had a quick introduction to the difficult art of peacekeeping in an environment full of guns. Today, talking was enough to solve the problem, but other KLA units may be far more difficult to disarm.
Their mercy, with a promise for all the world and a threat. We'll be back, this soldier shouted, but make sure you're not here. Imagine the Serbs' reversal of fortune today. The rulers have themselves become refugees. shedding tears of departure and stashing the loot, 2 phones in the back of the car. But the Serbs are scared. Having bombed them from the air, the Americans are now having to protect them on their way out, with the deadline fast approaching.
I told them at 1400 that they can move with the escort, or they can move whenever they want to. We're not stopping them at all.
Such is the Serbian fear of the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, and a campaign of revenge, that they're prepared to pack up in 20 minutes and accept an American escort. Their humiliation is complete.
Yesterday we had KLA with guns in town. They took post office and a local ambulance, and those people who worked there haven't been allowed to go in there, and people are scared now.
Brutality has given way to self-pity. Following the Serb armor is a pathetic trail of refugees. Overnight, the villains think they've become the victims in this war. 33,000 Serbian civilians have fled this province, the sacred heart of Mother Serbia, in the last 3 days. And yet, without these people, NATO's pledge of preserving a multi-ethnic Kosovo, where Serbs and Albanians live side by side, will never be fulfilled.
The Serb forces are leaving in humiliation, but that also means that the Serb civilians are fleeing this town because they don't have anyone to protect them, or at least they think so. The point is that the Serb civilians are afraid of the KLA, they don't trust NATO, and all that leaves NATO forces here with a real conflict about who exactly will control these streets.
Under the peace agreement, the KLA is supposed to be demilitarized. You could have fooled me. We went to see them at their new headquarters. Like any textbook liberation army, they took care to occupy the telephone exchange when they arrived here yesterday. Upstairs, they showed us just how banal the instruments of repression can be. All it took for the Serbs to cut off the telephone lines of every single Albanian household was a bag of toothpicks.
They inserted plastic sticks to cut the Albanian lines 3 months ago.
And toothpicks as well?
Yeah. They were short of plastic sticks, so they had to improvise.
Will you be putting some sticks in the Serbian lines?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Yeah. And downstairs, an uncanny coincidence, flowers for the commanders. The KLA would never have returned without NATO's help, but they're keen to be seen as the true liberators of Kosovo, and they're behaving as if they already run the place. It is they who decide which Serbs are allowed to stay or have to leave.
Wenn diese Leute, wat nützt in Krieg, mit Blut gehabt und hat nicht schießen.
Those people who had nothing to do with war, shooting or blood, he told me, they can stay, but the others have to go. You have to understand, he added, that some families lost as many as 4 or 5 people. On the streets of this town, it looks as if the KLA has got the respect of the people and the mandate to rule. Here they've occupied the hospital and turned it into a barracks, making a mockery of NATO. Demilitarization means the dismantling of military structures. The KLA is busy setting them up discreetly. And while British soldiers may be confiscating personal weapons, an American officer told us off the record that he was not in the business of taking them away from these young men. The Serbs, having a drink and a wash before fleeing as refugees, are scared of the KLA. These people know all about the power of the gun. They've just watched their own soldiers create the worst refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Some of them may have even taken part. Now they fear for themselves. Now NATO has said they will protect you all. Do you believe them? Do you trust NATO?
NATO je rekao da će sve da bude u redu.
No, we don't trust NATO, he told me. NATO is collaborating with the KLA. Why did they allow them to occupy the post office and the hospital? This man chimed in. They promised that no one is allowed to keep their guns, but the guns are still there. The war in Kosovo has been billed by the West as the first conflict in history to be fought for purely humanitarian principles. These American soldiers are here to enforce that vision, part of which is to make sure that Kosovo remains a land of many tribes. Anything else would mean the triumph of ethnic cleansing. The Serbs left town today, as you know, so civilians have fled.
Yeah.
They are saying that they don't trust NATO. NATO can't possibly protect them. They're afraid of the KLA. What do you say to those people who've left?
I'm sorry that they feel that way. The NATO force is here to protect everyone, the Serbs, the Albanians, the Montenegros, the Romano. We're here to make sure that every person in Kosovo is safe. That doesn't matter whether in the American sector, the Greek sector, the British sector, it does not matter.
So why all these Serb civilians fleeing?
I have no idea. You'd have to ask the Serbs and you'd have to ask the Albanians what the issues are between them.
NATO has told the Serbs, stay at home and we'll look after you. But by the end of the week, there may be no Serbs left in Kosovo. In Uroševac, reassuring them means disarming the KLA. And NATO, it seems, doesn't want to pick a fight.
That was Matt Fry. Well, ensure security in Kosovo, and any group that goes around using weapons against any other group is a threat. Now, as you heard earlier today, General Mike Jackson expects there to be a protocol signed fairly shortly between the KLA and KFOR, which will provide for the ceasefire, the disengagement and reintegration of forces, and that, we believe, will bring enhanced security to the
But I mean, for the moment, they can carry on carrying guns in the street, which obviously, if you're Serb, is threatening, isn't it?
Indeed, and that is why in this part of the sector, the British sector, we've made it quite clear that we're not prepared to have people carrying guns openly in the street in built-up areas.
All right, and are the rules different in the other sectors? Because today in Prizren, for example, the German area, I saw a lot of armed KLA men on the streets.
Well, clearly, each situation has to be dealt with as the commander finds it. All I can speak for is the British sector, where we have made it quite clear that we are not prepared to tolerate armed groups on the streets of built-up areas.
The streets and share the streets with NATO soldiers, who for now are making no attempt to disarm them. Both say they're in control.
So you say you're 100% in control, they say they're in control.
Exactly. What is the wrong thing?
It's heading north today, out of Kosovo, back to Serbia. And as they depart, behind them come British forces, advancing through the province to the ecstatic delight of Kosovo's Albanian population. But as they celebrate the arrival of NATO troops, it is now Serb civilians who are living in fear here. Fleeing north, running the gauntlet of Albanian hatred, convoys of Serb cars attacked by the Albanians. The smell of revenge and reprisal is in the air, and the Serbs do not trust NATO to stop it. Today we came across Alex village, where Kosovo Albanian gunmen had during the night ordered the Serbs out. They held a gun at our heads, this man told us. As a result, many Serbs were already leaving. Others told the British troops they simply did not trust NATO to protect them.
We have no trust, not in KLA, not in
As the Serbs depart, they are burning their own villages as well as Albanian ones. The fear this evening is...
Today, the Serbs departing Kosovo just as more of their Russian comrades were rolling in. Only a supply convoy, but the food and fuel will help Moscow extend its strategic lease on real estate NATO still wants, Pristina's airport. Russians at the airport today told CBS News they're comfortable and settled in. Their armor's painted KFOR, though NATO and Moscow have been at odds over Russia's role here. Everything's excellent, a Russian soldier was saying, until our conversation was interrupted by an angry Serb civilian who asked us to leave. This was the day the Serb army finally withdrew from Kosovo. NATO dominating Pristina, people were walking in the sunshine for the first time in months. Even the KLA came out of the shadows, glad to see the Serbs go, though the rebel army warns the Russians are unwelcome too. NATO now wants to disarm the KLA, and some American troops were doing that at a gas station, where Serbs and Albanians were just alike, sharing a need for fuel. The GIs feared a flashpoint and took away the rebels' guns.
We're doing a lot more. We're actually earning our money now.
It's the ultimate dream of NATO's mission, to seize the opportunities for cooperation here, along with the weapons.